A FedEx cargo 757 lands belly up, sliding out of control off the runway. We've seen what happened to the Jeju 737 in South Korea, but what happened here with FedEx Flight 1376 in Chattanooga, Tennessee? Now we know who or what is to blame. Let's go over the NTSB final report on this episode of Taking Off. Hi, I'm Dan Milliken. The NTSB has released a bunch of final reports lately, including the FedEx 757 that suffered a left hydraulic failure on takeoff that led to an emergency landing. Let's go over the final report and what they found and what we can take away from it. The similarities between the South Korea Jeju Air belly landing and this FedEx 757 belly landing are obvious, but there's certainly are key differences, like the fact that the Jeju 737 hit birds and they were on landing. The FedEx was on takeoff, and I'm going to address some important comparisons at the end of this video. As pilots, there are so many variables on a flight, so many ways to screw up. I remember long before I was a pilot, I was talking with an airline captain about a crash, and he said there's never a perfect flight, and when stuff goes south, a lot of finger pointing will turn to the pilots. And as I've become a pilot and have studied in depth many crashes, the thing you see over and over again is what they call the Swiss cheese model, where various mistakes and circumstances all line up that if one of those holes had been stopped, then the accident could have been averted. So with this FedEx crash, what finger pointing, what holes are there for the pilots? And how did the accident turn out? I'm going to tell you the story based on the NTSB investigation and the final report. It's the evening of October 4th, 2023, and it's approaching 10 p.m. Captain Brian DeVries, 41 years old, and First Officer Richard Summer, 53, are at Chattanooga, Tennessee, preparing for their freight dog trip to the FedEx hub at Memphis. They'll be taking a Boeing 757-200 series built in 1988 and converted from passenger carrying to cargo configuration in 2015. And they'll have one jump seater, a fellow FedEx pilot needing to get to Memphis. The flight crew looks over the maintenance logs and the airplane has no issues. They do all their pre-flight, their flight prep, and the pushback engine start, taxi were uneventful. For this leg, Captain DeVries will be the pilot flying and Summer will be the pilot monitoring and working the radios. The airport, designated CHA, is not a large airport, but they do have two intersecting runways, 1533 at 5,575 feet and 0220 at 7,400 feet. Captain DeVries taxis to runway 20. The local controller clears the 757 for takeoff at 10:21 and 54 seconds. Little did the crew know that they were moments away from a system failure that would lead to their emergency. As the aircraft accelerated down runway 22, First Officer Summer called out thrust set, and then he said 80 knots, followed shortly afterwards by V1, rotate, and then positive rate. The flight data recorder showed the wheels lifted at 10:23 and 42 seconds. Captain DeVries called for gear up 2 seconds later, and Summer moved the landing gear lever at 10:23, 47 seconds. An audible bump of the gear completing its retraction was heard at 10:23 and 58 seconds. In the CVR, the flight crew both indicated that the main landing gear and nose landing gear had retracted to their up and locked position 11 seconds after the audible completion of the landing gear going up is when the first signs of trouble started. At 10:29, 9 seconds, the hydraulic fluid quantity and pressure in the left hydraulic system began to decrease, and this was followed by a left hydraulic system low quantity indication and the master caution. At 10:24, 17 seconds, DeVries calls out left hydraulic quantity, and then he called for flaps up and asked Summer to ask ATC if they could just maintain runway heading. After Summer raised the flaps, a new caution warning beeped, and on the ICAS screen a message displayed, TE flap disagree. DeVries, checking it, called out, "Flaps disagree." ICAS, or Engine Indicating and Crew Alerting System, monitors the engines and the systems in real time, commonly found in most large airliners. And the TE stands for trailing edge, so the trailing edge flaps. And when that message is displayed, it means that the setting of the flap handle disagrees with the position of the flaps. For example, if you were at flaps 2, retracted them with the flap handle to 0, and got a disagree, it would mean that the flap stopped somewhere short of 0. Back on the flight deck of 1376, the master caution light and a trailing edge discrete light were illuminated. And this is at 10:24 and 52 seconds. At 10:25 and 1 second, DeVries says auto throttles are off, and Summer was telling ATC they were working on the issue and requested permission to maintain runway heading up to 5,000 feet. ATC approved the request. DeVries, always flying the plane, asked Summer to run the TE flap disagree checklist from the Quick Reference Handbook, the QRH, and that's always in reach of the pilots on the flight deck. It's designed for rapid use under pressure with clear, concise instructions. Summer completed the QRH for TE flap disagree at 10:29 and 12 seconds. DeVries asked him to send an ACARS text message to Fedex flight operations in Memphis of the aircraft's condition and asking if they should continue to Memphis or return to Chattanooga. At this point, DeVries was faced with that big question. He's got an issue. It's not yet an emergency, but it could easily become one. And if the hydraulic system is failing, did he really want to risk flying all the way to Memphis? Sure, that's where the hub is, where the maintenance lives, and Memphis has a runway that's 4,000 feet longer. But it's a risk leaving a perfectly good runway below you. And let me interrupt the story for this. In my research, I came across a very recent media story from WDEF Chattanooga that interviewed a, quote, pilot of over 40 years who is playing Monday morning quarterback, criticizing DeVries and Summer for the decision to land at Chattanooga. He makes his critical statements based simply on the fact that, spoiler alert, the 757 does overrun the runway in Chattanooga, while Memphis had the one that was 4,000 feet longer. But Captain DeVries had some very significant variables that the media doesn't really consider. First, let's talk fuel. Sure, the plane was loaded with enough fuel to make it to Memphis and have a reserve, but that's flying at altitude where the engines burn fuel more efficiently, and there's the drag of the flaps being extended. DeVries and Summer took the minutes at this point to crunch the numbers, taking all these variables into account. DeVries saw that by continuing to Memphis in their current condition, they wouldn't have very much fuel left in case they needed to do more troubleshooting in the air or had to go around. The same media story quotes DeVries as saying, I came up with a commit fuel of 7,000 pounds as we were currently burning close to 9,000 pounds per hour. This would have allowed us 2 attempts at landing before likely running out of fuel. And they had good weather at Chattanooga. And finally, it's very possible the QRH checklist had land at nearest suitable airport. We just don't know that at this point. I want to clarify something real quick, and I got some additional research after I filmed all of this and while I was editing this video. In talking to 757 pilots, another concern when you have hydraulic failure and clearly hydraulic leaking, which they did with the quantity alert for the left hydraulic system, is the potential for a fire hazard. You don't know where this leak is, and it could be close to the engine or some other hot motor. And this is just another reason it was a good call to stay close to an airport that you knew had good weather and that you could circle around while you worked the problem and not take off across country to that one in Memphis. In case of fire cropping up, you could get down fast. In talking to a bunch of airline pilots, none of these planes have gear up landing distance charts. So how long will a 757 belly land, slide down a dry runway? Who knows? Sitting in the captain's seat, 7,400 feet sounds plenty long. All right, back to the story. The crew of Flight 1376 informed ATC that they would return to Chattanooga, but they would still need time to work the checklist. The controllers vectored the flight back around and kept them north of the airport. ATC also asked if they would like to declare an emergency. At this point, DeVries declined. He continued to fly the airplane, and then Summer punched a lot of numbers into the flight management computer, the FMS. It's now 10:46 and 30 seconds. The crew selected flaps 1 using the alternate flap system and requested vectors back to runway 20. And while the flap movements were slower than normal, that was expected with the alternate flap system. With flaps configured for landing, it was time to deploy the gear. At 10:49 and 45 seconds, they pulled the gear lever down. 5 seconds later, a triple chime was heard, and DeVries said, "Gear disagree." Summer confirmed, "Gear disagree." And DeVries called ATC to break off the landing approach, telling them they had a gear unsafe indication. Now DeVries and Summer went methodically through the hydraulic system pressure left only QRH. They determined that the next step was to attempt an alternate gear extension. At 10:54 and 34 seconds, they attempted the alternate gear extension, but still had the gear disagree indication. It looks like it didn't work. Over the next 7 minutes, they completed the procedure several more times, including running the hydraulic system's pressure checklist in full. The QRH for the alt gear extend listed that the front landing gear steering would be inoperative, and because of this, the crew now declared an emergency. It's now 11:01, 17 seconds. The crew brought the jump seater to the flight deck. The jump seater is a Fedex pilot, and the three talked through the issue and the troubleshooting. They decided to radio FedEx Ops to speak with a maintenance technician, and while they waited for the technician to get to the radio, the three discussed their remaining fuel situation, and they made a fuel plan for when they would have to commit to landing. And after talking to the technician, the gear disagree was still lit. It's now over 10 minutes later as they've done all this work. At 11:11 p.m., the flight crew asked Chattanooga Approach if they could do a low approach over the runway so Tower could visually confirm the position of the landing gear. DeVries flew the plane to 150 feet above the ground over the runway, the full length of the runway, with a go-around at the end of that. ATC confirmed to them that the landing gear was not in the down position. The FedEx Ops Tech radioed another possibility of 2 circuit breakers to cycle. This was unsuccessful as well. The three on the flight deck continued to follow the gear disagree checklist. Captain DeVries decided that they would go ahead and land. At 11:39, the flight was cleared to land by the tower. DeVries briefed Summer that he was planning to aim close to the runway threshold, and Summer told him what the wind conditions were, and throughout the landing approach, he called out airspeeds for DeVries. They briefed the jump seater that he would open the L1, the left one door, when they landed. Nothing was left to do except belly land the Boeing 757. DeVries knew after touching down there would be very little he could do without brakes or steering. It was at 11:47 and 10 seconds when the belly made contact with the runway 1,650 feet from the threshold. 20 long seconds of scraping along the pavement. The audible alert system called out 500 feet remaining in the runway, but they were still sliding. 5 seconds after that, they left the runway, still pretty much center line. The recording stopped 3 seconds after that. And just like the now infamous Jeju 737 in South Korea, they belly landed, overran the runway, and impacted localizer antennas. The difference, and it's a huge difference. The FAA mandates antennas to be breakaway and a lot lower. The 757 came to rest intact, no fire, 830 feet beyond the end of the runway. When it stopped, The crew ran the evacuation QRH, and the jump seater attempted to open the L1 door, the left one door. It rotated halfway, but would not fully open, and the slide would not deploy. He moved to the right one, the R1 door, but it lodged on the slide pack. He then used force and finally got the slide pack to deploy, and all three evacuated out the right, the R1 door, uninjured. Okay, what happened? First, let's talk about the landing gear and the hydraulic system on the aircraft. The 757 has three hydraulic systems, left, right, and center. The landing gear is operated by the left hydraulic system. It can also be operated by the right hydraulic system. When there is a loss of left hydraulic system pressure, for example, loss of fluid, the landing gear doors can't be opened. The alternate landing gear extension system relies on an alternate extension power pack that will open the doors so that the landing gear can just begin a free fall down to the locked position. With the primary system failing, why did the alternate fail as well? First, let's talk about the hydraulic failure in the left system. That was caused by a ruptured left main gear door actuator hose from fatigue, which prevented the normal landing gear operation. Okay, so what about the alternate then? This failure was caused by a broken wire due to tensile overload between the alt gear extend switch and the alt extension power pack. The power pack couldn't be energized when they hit the switch, basically a short. The NTSB has made recommendations to the FAA and to Boeing to correct these issues. I talked to a Fedex 757 pilot. The right side hydraulic system would still require fluid in the left side to be able to extend the gear. And that's why Boeing created an alternate method, which is a power pack that opens the gear doors. When the gear is raised, it's unlocked in the gear bay and actually sits on the gear doors. If the gear doors were open, the gear would fall down through and with gravity and they would lock. If you do want to find the Swiss cheese holes, those would be two. But the hole that wasn't there was the pilots. They prevented loss of life. The flight crew exercised great crew resource management, CRM. And here's what the NTSB report found after a thorough investigation. I quote, "The crew of FedEx Flight 1376 demonstrated good CRM by remaining calm and professional throughout the accident sequence of events. They displayed effective workload management by distributing the tasks of handling the emergency amongst themselves to avoid overload and maintain optimal performance, which resulted in the captain flying and the FO working to resolve the issue with ATC. The crew maintained clear and concise communication between all crew members to include a jump seat occupant and with ATC actively soliciting feedback and input and cross-checking with one another to ensure everyone was working with the same mental model. Once the crew realized the landing gear was inoperable, they methodically worked through the QRH, confirming each step out loud and demonstrating flexibility by adjusting their plans and strategies based on changing circumstances. The crew used all available resources and included some non-standard attempts at troubleshooting, such as pulling circuit breakers while under the direction of FedEx maintenance staff. So often, reports reveal the probable cause to be the pilots, but there are times when you have to act with the cards dealt and make great calls. This crew did that. So finger pointing at the pilots? Not this time. They did a fabulous job. They were well trained and made solid choices working with what they had. Well done, guys. And that's what I can really pull away from this. Training, remaining calm, effective communication with your crew resource management. They say that in a crisis, you don't rise to the occasion, you fall to your level of training. So this is a good reminder to me to keep training. Train these emergencies all the time so that when in the heat of the moment, I can fall to my best level of training. That's my takeaway. Well, that wraps up the report on FedEx Flight 1376. Thanks for watching, and if you like hardcore aviation content, check out our sister channel In the Hangar by clicking right here. And also, thanks to our sponsors who make this content possible, like FlyingEyesOptics.com. You see, they created these frames that are really incredibly thin, but also incredibly strong. And when you put them under helmets and headsets, they're amazing. I hated wearing headphones with my old glasses. They would press the frames. Flying Eyes are the most comfortable glasses you can ever get. Use our discount code, taking off all caps, one word, for 10% off. I've got a link in the description below to them and all our sponsors, like Clemens Insurance. They saved me over $1,000 when I switched over to them. ClemensInsurance.net. If you enjoyed this final report, check out our other one by clicking right here. Thanks again, and remember, superior judgment trumps superior skill. Take care.